I've talked so far about under this version of capitalism, we have seen personal suffering intensified, made more frequent, and made more intense. But in my book, I go a little deeper than that. I actually look at how today's capitalism, which is, as I mentioned before, a culture that we live in, not just an economic system, that today's capitalism is changing how we suffer. Not just that we're suffering more or more intensely, it's changing the nature of suffering. So I believe we're seeing a new form of suffering emerging today, which I call in the book third order suffering. Well, what does that mean? First order suffering is the suffering that comes from just being a human being. It's existential. It comes from being mortal, so that we're subject to disease, we're subject to injury, of course, we're subject to someday die. And worse than that, we have to experience and endure the deaths of people we love who matter to us. That's first order suffering. It's not going away, no matter what we do. Second order suffering is technically unnecessary suffering, and yet we do it to each other anyway. So second order suffering is suffering from the injustices that we impose upon each other. At the interpersonal level in everyday life, we know what this feels like. Friends betray us, they stab us in the back. We may experience crimes. People murder other people. At the societal level, injustice occurs through the making of war, through ongoing systems that we're very aware of today, such as ongoing racism and sexism in our society that is causing massive suffering across the country today. That's second order suffering. So third order suffering, what is that? Well, third order suffering is not replacing these other forms of suffering. It's a kind of suffering that is rising up alongside them and is intermingling or becoming entangled with first and second order suffering, so that it's actually altering how we experience those forms of suffering. Well, what causes this and what is it? Neoliberal capitalism is doing three things to us that lead to this kind of suffering. One is that it's breaking down the bonds that unite us as collectives to one another. So during the neoliberal phase, since roughly the 1980s, not just in the US and the UK, but worldwide, wherever this has gained traction, we've seen the erosion of civic organizations, of neighborhoods, of labor unions, of religious congregations, of religion itself, so that we no longer bond together and belong to something like we once did before this phase of capitalism. A second thing that goes along with that is that the narratives of meaning, the historic narratives, the grand narratives, as some have called them, that make meaning of our lives are going away. The language that we use to think about our suffering and what it means is gradually disappearing. And as those two things happen, as collectives are eroded, as the grand narratives that gives our life meaning are being eroded, the third thing happens, and that is that we begin to disintegrate as selves. We lack cohesive selves, so that it becomes hard for us to know who we really are, as opposed to how we're marketing ourselves to be under our brands. All of these three things are happening together and reinforce one another. The result is a kind of suffering that we've seen in history at times of social dislocation, say when a whole people is like the indigenous Americans were run off their land. They experience this kind of suffering transitionally. But what we're seeing now is third order suffering has become normative. It's not just happening when capitalism breaks down. It's happening when capitalism does its thing. It's becoming normative. And there are two features of this kind of suffering to pay attention to, and both are forms of unconsciousness. It produces what I call a double unconsciousness. First of all, we become, because of the individualism that is being preached, we become unconscious of how our personal suffering is connected to the wider social context, and we're misled to believe our sufferings are just coming from inside our heads and are our responsibility alone. That's the first lack of consciousness. A second layer of unconsciousness comes when, because of the massive entertainment industry and all the things that are created now by international corporations to distract us from our suffering and pain, we lose consciousness of our suffering even being suffering. We lose awareness that we are in pain. The result of these two kinds of unconsciousness is what I call in the book zombie suffering. So we're walking around, falling apart, but we are not awake. So what are we going to do about this? And I end the book suggesting that as a beginning, we need to do three things. We need to, first of all, rebuild collectives. We need to, and this has to happen organically. You can't just build a community like you would build a house. It has to happen organically, like a forest growing. You can't build a forest. It just has to emerge. But we have to encourage these communities to grow. And not just any collectives, but collectives that nurture the soul. What do I mean by the soul? Well, soul I don't think of as some disembodied thing that animates our bodies. I think of soul as the connective fabric, the fabric that connects ourselves, to other people, to society, to the planet itself, and to the eternal. When this fabric falls apart, our souls weaken and become sick. And finally, we need to nurture communities that amplify hope, that instill in us again a kind of new utopianism, not a blueprint utopianism, but a kind of utopianism that dares to dream, to listen for things that are emerging that can bring to us a better world if we only work together. So this is the journey I am on, not just in the book, but in life. I want to join with others who are on that quest for a new world, and I hope you will join it as well.